Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this exciting webinar, What's the Big Deal? A Federal Election Inquiry. I'm Sheila Hogan, President of Voices of MacKellar. I'd like to begin by firstly acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, and for whom sovereignty was never ceded. I live on the land of the Garigal clan, of the Guringai people, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. For those of you who don't know, Voices of MacKellar, we're a grassroots community organization based on Sydney's northern beaches, originally established to provide a forum for community voices to be heard, respected, and counted. We are a nonpartisan and not aligned to any political party, individual candidate, or representative. Our aim is to encourage increased community participation in our democracy and to encourage the highest standard of political representation. We're hosting this webinar tonight in response to findings from our MacKellar Matters Report 2022, which ranked the lack of transparency and accountability in politics as the #2 issue of concern. More specifically, the concerns were related to the area of political donors and lobbyists. This report can be found on our website if you're interested. But tonight is not about Voices of MacKellar. It is about helping communities all over Australia to understand how we can be part of the change we want to see. And to that note, I can see many people have joined us. So I really it's an amazing opportunity to be here with our guests. And I just want to thank you again to everyone for joining, and thanking those who made a donation to Voices of MacKellar when you registered. It's much appreciated, especially to support events like tonight and all the people that supported it and the work that goes into it. So just a few housekeeping guidelines. Please feel free to say hi in the chat and let us know where you're from. We're happy to have your beautiful faces on video, but please know you will be muted at all times. Please put your questions in the chat. We ask that you keep questions short and to the point. And of course, we also ask that all chats remain respectful and relevant. So now I'm pleased to hand over the moderation of this evening to our committee member, Marie Nutt, who has been a big proponent of this webinar. Not only is Marie a founding member of the Voices of MacKellar, she has spent more than 30 years influencing decision-making on the issue of global poverty, as volunteer and then CEO of Results, a grassroots advocacy charity. Empowering the voices of everyday people in our democracy is something Marie has long been passionate about, and I'm very proud to hand over to you, Marie.
Thanks, Sheila. And hello, everyone. It's so great to have you all joining tonight. I'm really looking forward to it. So just to let you know how the next hour will run, after I introduce our guests, I'll pose each of them a few questions so we can give you a better understanding of the issues, the opportunities of the parliamentary inquiry into the federal election and what it provides for you, and also the steps for how to make your submission to the inquiry as easy as possible, because that is our ultimate aim from tonight. We'll have time for your questions at the end, so please, when you feel the urge, put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We'll wrap up at 8 p.m. with how Voices of MacKellar will continue to support you with your submissions up until the submission deadline, which is Friday, the 7th of October. So now let me introduce our very special guests. It's my great pleasure to introduce Craig Rucastle, who many of you will already know as an Australian television and radio comedian. He's best known for Win the Week, Big Deal, a big topic for tonight, Fight for Planet A, War on Waste, The Chaser, and more. Craig has an impressive track record in delivering engaging content and campaigns that raise awareness, change behaviour, and influence policy. It's great to have you back with us again, Craig. Welcome.
Great to be back, Marie. Yeah, congratulations to Voices of MacKellar. I've spoken to you guys before. It's been very impressive to see the kind of way you guys have engaged with your community, put out reports and really got to the bottom of what matters to people in the area. So it's great. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. We could do it without the support of our fantastic MacKellar community. So next to our second speaker is Saffron Zoma. Saffron is the Executive Director of the non-partisan and non-profit organisation, the Australian Democracy Network. She's a lawyer, a campaigner and a political strategist with over a decade of experience in law reform campaigns. Before this, Saffron was the Government Relations Manager at the Australian Conservation Foundation after several years in the US working on campaigns and in other government relations roles. Welcome to you, Saffron.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
And I'm really pleased to see that Saffron has brought with her Cheryl He, who's also from the Australian Democracy Network. Cheryl is the digital organiser there and has worked very closely on this campaign and is particularly familiar with the web portal that we are going to be recommending you use to make your submission. So Cheryl's going to take us through some of those practical questions tonight. So thanks for joining with us as well, Cheryl.
Thanks for having me. Great to see so many faces out there.
All right, so let's get moving. Craig, we're going to start. So your documentary, Big Deal, really put a spotlight on the issue of money in politics. And we're confident that it's provided a nudge for this parliamentary inquiry that's taking place right now. Now, Saffron's going to talk more about the terms of reference for that inquiry shortly, but they line up pretty well alongside the main issues of your documentary, namely donation transparency, donation caps, and when donations are publicly declared. So we'd be really interested to hear what you discovered about all of these issues when you were making Big Deal.
Yeah, great. Look, I don't think the movie can take credit for this. I think it's more the fact that a lot of people seem to care about it in various parts of Australia in the end. I think that's the most important part that's led to this. And I will say, by the way, that in the research for this movie, there have been other parliamentary inquiries over the years. So it is, and sometimes they kind of have the same people from a lot of legal backgrounds writing in. I would say that what is great about this one is they're already seeing, and hopefully more people from tonight will put in their own submissions, put them in your own words, make people aware that this is not a specialized interest point, that lots of people care. And, you know, it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be technical. Just put in there your feelings about it. I think that's really important. So look, when you look at this issue, there's a lot to outrage you about it. I mean, we'll start with the kind of simple one about when we find out about donations. So, you know, we live in this incredible technically advanced world where we find out data immediately, constantly. Yet when it comes to political donations, we tend to find them out about 18 months after most of them have happened, between a year and 2 years after the donations have actually been made. And again, it's this ridiculous thing where you go, well, Queensland has actually changed this rule, and Queensland, you find out about who's made donations within a week of it happening. And so it's clearly something that can be done really simply and be done easily, but there's a lot of pushback against it. And there's always these ridiculous excuses about why it's not happening. So that's one of, I think, the simplest things that can be done. Is it something that really should be changed, is that we should know where these donations are coming from, and particularly once they're above, I would say particularly $500, but you know, 500, you know, that kind of, you need to have a reasonably low threshold so you know where they're coming from. The broader question about donation transparency is an amazing one in Australia. Like, partly because of where the threshold sits, and the threshold was increased by John Howard many years ago. So it started at $10,000 and now each year it goes up. So it's around $14,000 now. If you make a donation under $14,000, you're not required to actually, you don't have to be outed as somebody who's made a donation. You don't actually have to be any transparency of that. And not only that, there's a lot of other loopholes whereby people would make numerous donations to different bodies, and that wouldn't necessarily be added up and put on the website or anywhere printed. So donation transparency is extraordinary. It's some of the studies we looked at showed that over 50% of donations made to political parties, you don't know where they came from, and you never find out where they come from. It's not a case of, it's basically that half of them you will find out who made the donation about 12 months too late, and the others you'll never find out. So it's a ridiculous system. And look, it's been made by the political parties that clearly don't want you knowing where those donations are coming from. But I must admit, one of the big things for me in looking at this is I probably came into it thinking we need greater transparency, we need greater transparency. But by the end of it, I was like, that's not enough. It really isn't enough. And I think Christian Van Buren, who hosted it, was similar. It's kind of to a similar conclusion that it was, you need a cap on donations, you need a cap on spending as well. And this, for me, comes back to the kind of fundamental question about this. What's this about? It's about democracy. Right? Democracy is about one person, one vote. It's about equality in the system. Now, you can have a system where you have one person, one vote, but if you have also one person who can put in $80 million, as Clive Palmer does, and $80 million into the system to affect advertising and all these other things, it's extremely hard to have an even democratic system where there's that kind of distorting influence. So I think we need to really push for caps on the size of donations. So there must be a limit, a realistic limit. That means that, yes, the voices of people will have a lot of money, in a sense, we'll probably have a bit more influence, but it can't be so massively out of just the proportion. You know, if you set a limit of $5,000, and there are countries around the world that have low limits on how much you can donate and have similar limits on companies' donations as well. So if you donate that, but you also donate the caps on spending. And this is interesting, speaking to politicians I spoke to particularly one in New South Wales, who they'd put in place a cap on spending at the state level there. And they said it took a lot of pressure out of having to raise money constantly. And it means that, again, because there's a limit how much can be spent, everyone's on a bit more of an even playing field. And that comes back to that fundamental democratic question here of like, if you have the system where people can donate as much money as they like, they can spend as much money as they like on adverts. The adverts don't even have to be true. There's no truth in advertising requirements for democracy in Australia. It's utterly ridiculous. You get such a distorted system that it really does undermine Australian democracy. So yeah, look, on all of those levels, I'm glad they're asking for input on this. And let's get writing. I'm actually, by the way, very glad to be on this because I haven't started writing my submission yet. So I'm going to be listening in very carefully as well to find out how to put it in as well. So Cheryl, I'll be listening.
And we'll be checking.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Craig. So I know, but that before I saw the big deal, I really had no sense of any of this issue. So I think you underestimate the impact the big deal had. And I really wanted to ask you, and maybe Saffron can touch on it later as well. But have you had sort of more engagement? Have you seen changes in the attitudes of people to this issue since your documentary?
Well, it's interesting. Again, I can't show the documentary's role in it, but it was fascinating to see at the federal election that numerous candidates got up on essentially, particularly on running on climate and integrity, which is fascinating to see. And also that integrity played a much bigger role in the conversation in the election than I've seen at any other time. So it's fascinating to see that happening. And it is interesting to see, one of the strange things about our documentary, for those who haven't seen it, is that it's not like Four Corners, right, where it sets out and shows you somebody who's broken the law and should go to jail, right? It actually shows everything we show you in the documentary is legal, and that was the point. Is like all this stuff you're utterly outraged by, and it's totally and utterly legal. So one thing with calling for an integrity commission is, yes, you can have an integrity commission. Yes, you can have that looking at, you know, what politicians are doing. But at the moment, there aren't the rules there in many cases. So the integrity commission technically could go, we think this is not particularly great behavior, but it's not breaching any rules. And this is where this particular inquiry is really important, is that we need to get a better foundation of rules there so the integrity commission can actually be enforcing them. And at the moment, we've got a great system in Australia at the moment, which is that we have terrible rules and almost no enforcement. Great approach. I think we should probably improve that.
Thanks, Craig. That's actually a perfect segue for me to now come to Saffron. So Saffron, as we remember, is from the Australian Democracy Network and really leading on helping the public be aware of this inquiry. But Saffron, there are many parliamentary committees and there are several inquiries happening at any one time. But what's the purpose of this particular inquiry and what changes could it lead to?
So this inquiry is being conducted by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, which means that it's a standing committee, so it's not just been created ad hoc for this one particular inquiry, and it's joint, so it includes representatives from both houses of Parliament and also non-government members. So you'll see a number of people sitting on that committee who represent different political views and come from both sides of the building. The committee was initiated in 1987, and I think every election since 87, one of the key responsibilities of this committee is to review the conduct of the past election to see if there were any irregularities or anything to learn from it, and just basically to have a really good look at the issues that that election threw up and consider them. And that's what this inquiry will do again. I've seen a little bit of chatter in the chat. Some people are coming with a healthy dose of skepticism about how the committee process runs and how useful it is. And I think I would say just at the top that, you know, a process is a process. There's no guarantee from any process, and, you know, you should all be realistic about that. But I think there's a pretty clear track record that governments have used these election reviews to signal what they intend to do in the campaign finance reform space. So last year, I don't know if you remember, we saw a proposal from the government to introduce a requirement for voter identification at election time. That came as a surprise to many people, but it was actually first raised in the previous election's JSCAM election review. So it can really be a way that the government explores what it wants to do, sets its agenda, here's what different stakeholders have to say. And in this case, we've heard very clearly from the government that they are treating this particular committee review very seriously. And it will be the first step towards legislation. There will be legislation across some of these terms of reference. We can't say exactly what it will look like, but this is the first step that will set the stage or the parameters, I suppose, for how the government will take on these issues. And so it's a really important opportunity for all of us to raise our voice and help shape what that outcome looks like.
Fabulous, thank you. So let's delve into those terms of reference now, Saffron. And also I want to hear from you why your organisation has chosen one of the terms of reference in particular to focus on.
Yes, great. So the terms of reference are actually really broad. They cover donations, caps and disclosure, as Craig mentioned, electoral expenditure caps and public funding as well. Truth in political advertising. There's a new item there this year around increasing electoral participation and enfranchisement of First Nations people. And there's terms of reference which go to territory representation as well. So those are a little different to standard. But yes, those terms of reference do cover a broad suite of interconnected reforms that would change the way that we do politics in this country. And we are always of the view that in this space, there is no such thing as a silver bullet, unfortunately. We definitely need a National Anti-Corruption Commission, but that on its own, as Craig just said, if the laws are lousy, won't fix everything. In the same way that donations caps and electoral spending caps work together. So if you do one and not the other, you haven't actually fixed the problem. We need them both. We also need disclosure. And we think we also need reforms to the way lobbying happens as well. So there's more transparency and we stop that revolving door between cushy industry jobs and political leadership. So we chose to focus on the term of reference that went specifically to election spending caps. And we made that decision because we got the sense that that was the important part of the mix that had the least political traction. We're seeing the least conversation about that out in the media and in political circles. And we wanted to make sure that it didn't get left behind so that the government might choose to do donations disclosure and then decide that that was enough, because we know that's not enough, and we want to make it really clear that there's broad public support for a much more ambitious reform agenda. So that's what we chose to do. Of course, our framework for a fair democracy covers all of those policies that are in these terms of reference and more as well. And we definitely encourage folks to go and check out that full suite, and definitely don't feel limited by our recommendation. You should include whichever terms of reference speak to you the most.
Terrific. So you can see the website for Our Democracy there, and you can go and have a look at all of those elements later on. So I think Craig touched on this a little bit at the beginning as well, but you know, some advocates, well, so the question was, you know, what are these committees actually do, and are their inquiries important? Saffron, you've already answered that at the beginning, but let's deal with the actual submissions, because that's what we want people to be doing after tonight. And some advocates would say, and perhaps there are people on this call who might also be thinking, that submissions are a waste of time and resources for civil society or, you know, the general public. So what would you say to people on this call that might be thinking that?
I get asked along those lines quite often, you know, like if we run a campaign that asks people to call their member of parliament or write them a letter, and people are like, oh, isn't it just a waste of time? No one will pay attention to my call. And I always think the answer to that is definitely that it just depends. We know that to get this very busy government to prioritise action on this particular issue, which matters to all of us, we need to keep it on the agenda. And always with any big issue like this, there are going to be headwinds. You can just assume that there will be a lot of people who stand to lose from these changes, and they'll be pushing back against them. So it's safe to assume that if we don't create the counter pressure to move this agenda forward, then it will be pushed back. So we can't take any outcome on this for granted. If we want it, we have to speak up for it now. And in this case, I would say it's almost more guaranteed to make a difference than many other ways that we have available to us to participate. A public servant will 100% read your submission. And the people who've already used our portal to submit have generated some media already, which I think Cheryl just popped in the chat. The headline of that basically says that the government is committing itself to legislate spending caps, which we have all been asking for, which is pretty incredible. And the chair of the commission says at the bottom of the article that she is really pleased to be hearing from the community on this issue. So your submission doesn't have to be learned or detailed, or even have like dollar figure amounts for caps or anything like that. Our job when we write submissions is to let our parliament know that this is an issue on which we all demand action. And then they will see the political cost or opportunity of prioritising these issues. So it should definitely feel like something that's accessible to anyone who has an opinion. That's all you need.
Great.
Can I back up Saffron for 2 seconds? Sorry, Craig here again. I just quickly on that point about skepticism. I know there is a natural skepticism about this, but it's not that all politicians want the system to remain as it is. A lot of them hate it. A lot of them don't like having to raise money. A lot of them are there for good reasons on all parties. This is not a partisan issue here. This is an issue where there's people in all parties that are trying to push for change and trying to get change. And so the more they know there are people in the community really pushing to back them up, the more likely they are to get that change. So don't presume that every politician is sitting there going, no, we want to keep this system going like it is. That's not the case. And we have seen positive changes in state levels, at state level around Australia, coming from all different parties as well. So, you know, we can get change in this area. It's not pointless, and you're not fighting against everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for that. That's such a really, really important point. There are examples where it has happened. So there's definitely a precedent there. Okay, so we're going to move to Cheryl now for those tips and the how-to components of tonight. So Cheryl, hit us with your top tips for writing a simple submission.
Like Saffron and Craig said, they don't need to be super learned. They don't need to be super detailed. You don't need to have a lot of in-depth knowledge about the issues. Useful submissions, they make a clear argument, they contain recommendations for action, and they provide any references or resources to back up that argument. So with that in mind, my top tips for writing a powerful submission would be, firstly, to stay focused on the issue or the issues within the terms of reference. I know it's super tempting to think about all the different ways that our electoral system could be improved, but the inquiry is set up specifically to investigate those terms of references and only those terms of references. So anything that sits outside those terms is actually beyond their scope and won't be useful or accepted. I'm just going to drop a link in the chat that contains the terms of references. My second tip is, don't feel like you need to address every single term of reference. So there are 7 big issues that they are investigating in this inquiry. But not everyone is going to know much or feel strongly about all of them. So if you feel strongly, say, about truth in advertising or a cap on election spending, or if you have knowledge about one of the specific terms of reference, it's better to focus on that, and it's better to flesh out that issue and that term of reference more thoroughly rather than touch base lightly on all of them. My third tip is to use evidence, and if you do have time, do a little bit of research to back that evidence up. So like any good essay, evidence is only going to make your argument stronger. And you can refer to your own personal experience and feelings as evidence. So maybe there was a moment where you saw a blatant lie being advertised during the election campaign. How did that make you feel? What kind of impact do you think that that has on our political system when there are no penalties for that? And what do you think should change? Or perhaps you watch Big Deal and you learned that there was no limit to how much a political party or a campaigner can spend to influence voters in a federal election. How does that impact our political system when, you know, money speaks volumes like that? What do you think needs to change? So essentially, you're just talking about the terms of reference, how they make you feel, what impact they have on our political system, and what you think should change. You can also go a step further and do a little bit of research into the topics. On our page, which I will go through later, we have a few different resources that you can use to research and get a little bit more evidence to write with. And my last tip number 4 is that there is actually no set format for making a submission. So if you want to get creative because writing isn't your forte, you can feel free to send a voice recording, or you can send a video through as a submission rather than writing a submission. And on our FAQ page, there is an email for you to send that through. I will go through that later. But just keep in mind the same thing as you would in a written submission. So stay focused clearly on the issues in the terms of reference, make a clear argument, and then a recommendation for action. So yeah, they are my 4 tips. Stay focused on the issue. Don't feel like you need to address every single term of reference. Use evidence, so your personal experience and your anecdote, and some research if possible. And then also don't feel limited to writing a submission.
And there's no set length that it can be either, Cheryl. So I've seen submissions that were 50 pages long, and I've seen them that were half a page long. So
yes, you're right. There's no limit to how long they can be, but do keep in mind that whoever it will be, they will be received and they will be read by someone on the other end. And that person and those people are going to be reading through and going through hundreds of submissions. So keep it succinct, keep it tight, keep it to the point, and make a clear argument and recommendation.
great. So do you want to now take us through your web portal, which is one easy way or a place that people can make their submissions?
Yeah, absolutely. I might first actually take you through a couple examples of some submissions, if that's all right. How is everybody seeing my screen? Thumbs up? I'll just give you a few moments to have a read through this submission. And I think the main thing to know is that, you know, this is not someone who's spent, you know, lots of time in, investigating and learning about caps on political donations. This is just, you know, a citizen who's concerned about it and expressing their opinions. If anyone has any anything they'd like to note about the submission or any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat as well. And I think what I'd like to note is that they have clearly touched on the terms of reference. So the issue has been clearly, where is it? So I firmly believe there needs to be a cap on how much business a political party and an individual can spend on elections. So they make a recommendation as to what needs to change. They're using their own personal anecdotes as evidence as to why, which is also really compelling. Are people ready for me to move on to the next submission? This is also another really strong submission. And I think similarly, they've explicitly mentioned a cap on electoral spending, which is one of the terms of references. They have outlined what needs to change, so a limit to influence the rich. And they've expressly outlined that a cap will go some way to help ensure politics and politicians are accessible to all in the community and not just an elite few. I really love this line. After all, politicians are supposed to be working towards what is best for their community, country, and the world. Isn't that right? So I'm going to move this on to how to actually use our portal. So we set this up as a really simple way for anyone to be able to make a submission to JSCAP. Rather than asking people to create an online account at APH, we thought we'd take all the hassle out of it and just make a portal where people, all they needed to do was just have a read of the context, write their submission, and then just pop in their address and their names. So when you head to this website, I will pop it into the, is someone able to pop this website into the link if that hasn't been done already, into the chat, sorry. So this will give you a little bit of context as to what the inquiry is, what kind of impact it has. Something to note that we have already talked about today is that we are asking people to write about a cap on election spending. But yeah, don't feel limited to only talking about a cap on election expenditure. You know, the terms of reference have 7 different issues that you can talk about. We just thought strategically that this is what we would push our supporters to write about. So after you've had a read of our context, there are a few drop-down buttons. So we have what to include in your submission, have a read of those, and then have a go at writing out a submission. And then before you submit it, there is a submissions checklist. So there are a few questions you just need to ask yourself before you submit. So has my submission been written for the purpose of the inquiry? Have I checked that this is not material that has been previously published? So it's not just something that's been copy and pasted from an article. Although you can make references to resources, you just need to be explicit about it. Have you commented on some or all of the terms of references? Have you provided your return postal email address, which you don't need to include in the body of the submission because it will be included automatically through this portal when you pop your details in. And then if you do want to make your submission confidential, you just need to make it explicit at the start of your submission and why. As I said before, we do have a few extra resources for anyone looking to do a bit of research on some of the issues covered in the terms of reference. We have an FAQ website, which I'll take you to. And if you are wanting to get creative and submit, say, a video or a voice recording, the email to do that is at the bottom of the FAQ right here. If I can just get back into, In terms of resources, we have our framework for a fair democracy, which outlines our recommendations. For the terms of reference, we have the Human Rights Law Centre, which wrote a report about how powerful industries corrupt our democracy. And we have Confronting State Capture, which is also a report written by ADN about state capture. And as always, we have an email here if you get stuck on writing a submission, you have a question, or you want someone to have a look at it before you submit. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. All you need to do is enter your residential address, your first name, your last name, and then you pop your submission in here, and then you send your submission off, and you will get a copy of it sent to your inbox. All right.
Fantastic. And I just there's quite a lot of information on that webpage, as you can see. So thank you to you, Cheryl and Saffron, for all of the work on that. When I did my submission, I started drafting it just on a Word document, and then I copied it into that section. That was the easiest way for me to do it, because I kept changing it. I was going to say something else. I just wanted to clarify for people, in case they were concerned about their submission being sent through a portal such as this. We did confirm with the committee secretariat, because this isn't a copy and paste submission that you're writing an original piece, that they're all being dealt with separately and individually. So don't feel as though if you're going through this portal, it won't be acknowledged and counted, because it actually will be. So that's really important, and just makes the job a whole lot easier. So I think, I can't remember who said before, but I know it was Saffron who was saying that each submission will be read by somebody in the secretariat at least, and then they will be lodged on the committee inquiry web page, so that they're all made public. We're talking about transparency here. So is there anything that we should know, just quickly looking at the time, about what will happen to these submissions afterwards?
So essentially, once a submission is received, they're all read. The committee decides whether or not to accept it, and then they authorize its publication. You'll get an email letting you know about this. And then the committee can also decide whether to only publish partial parts of the submissions when it's relevant. Once it is accepted and authorized for publication, your personal details are removed and the document is placed on the website. And then it essentially forms a part of the formal record of this inquiry. And then the committee will use this as the evidence that it is gathered and received to draw together really reasoned conclusions and recommendations for action. And then the committee will present a report to the Parliament, which includes publishing it both online and in print. And then the Australian government will generally make a formal written response to the recommendations made in the report. And like what Saffron said before, we know that Don Farrell has said that following the committee's recommendations, we intend to legislate. So essentially what we are doing with these submissions is we are helping to shape the election reform agenda for this term of government.
Great. There's a couple of, so we're going to get some more questions about the process here. I can see some of the ones that are coming through. So thank you so much, Cheryl, for all of that really helpful information. And I'm really glad to see that info at Our Democracy email address. We might put that up a couple more times if anyone has any questions, or they want somebody to just have a check of their submission, that's something that you're offering to do, which is fantastic. So if we now go to our Q&A, so we're compiling some questions in the Q&A. So if we bring back Saffron and Craig, I'm going to go back quickly to Cheryl, though. Someone here has written, Audrey has written, I'm a permanent resident, but I'm not able to vote. Can I make a submission?
I'm going to be honest and say that I do not know the answer to that. Saffron, do you know?
I don't, but I would totally just submit. If the committee thinks that it's not okay, they'll just disregard it. Definitely, right?
And you don't need to pop in any like details about, you know, your citizenship or permanent residency. So
I'm going to add here that I'm pretty sure I read that you don't have to be a permanent resident, because I've seen other inquiries where people have made submissions from overseas, so expert groups from overseas. So I would say that it's okay, Audrey, for you to make your submission. And I would also say I've read something where you don't have to be 18. You can make submission. I saw someone who was under the age of 18 recommending that the voting age be reduced. So I'm going to say it's okay. John wants to know if there are any independents on the JSCEM. Saffron?
I did hear from one of them that they were negotiating with the government to get a spot on the committee, because all of them are interested in these issues. I don't know how that will resolve. But of course, there are members of the Greens, if you consider them crossbench. I assume that the question was talking more about a teal. So yes, I think that's a live conversation.
So I've seen two questions that kind of link to each other. One was asking about the donations to the Teal independents in the last election. But also it goes to this question of donation caps. So Rebecca asks, what suggestions do panelists have for balancing the needs to allow new entrants to have a fighting chance, for example, independents and minor parties, and capping the mega dollars that billionaires and major parties have access to? So I'd like you to maybe also address, Craig and Saffron, this idea of spending caps in the election and donation caps to the political parties, how that would actually work in terms of when it comes to an election campaign and what the parties can spend during that campaign, and how to make that playing field level, for example, as Rebecca is suggesting, for independents, minor parties or the like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I expressed this poorly in the chat there, but firstly, that if you reduce the amount, the cap, if you put a cap on spending, it obviously makes it easier for somebody who doesn't have such access to large amounts of money. So if you're saying everybody that's running in this seat has a cap of, let's say, hypothetically $100,000 to spend, that makes it more likely that a candidate's going to be able to compete by just raising small donations from members of the public in that area, rather than needing to go out and get very large donations to balance it out. And just by the way, in terms of the teals, and I know that some of them would say, look, it was an unnecessary evil that you had to raise so much money, and they would hope not to have to do that as going forward in the future as well. That's part of the problem, is that in order to compete in the current system, there was people had to raise so much money, and obviously that excludes other groups from being able to compete. So I think that it's important, given that a lot of it, I think there's a fairness that comes from public funding. Public funding is often paid after an election. So you do have to have it that people can raise some money from community and supporters so that they can run their campaign and then get that money back from public funding afterwards. So I'm not saying that you should never have any donations, but again, it goes back to that core idea of making it more democratic, saying if everyone can raise up to, $500 from everyone, then it's a lot harder to actually just go and get all of that money from one person.
Saffron, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, starting with the caveat that we haven't landed a position on this in detail, so I'm not announcing a firm position that we've taken, but I think part of the answer to this problem is outside the frame, and that is we have to regulate donations and spending, because that is an essential way of controlling state capture, which is a cancer on democracy and has to be stopped. But part of the problem that makes it so hard for people to come and challenge incumbents is the privileges of incumbency that come with being part of a big party. Things like if you have 5 electorate staff who can all work on your campaign full time through the election period, that's a resource that if you're an independent challenger, for example, you just don't have. There are other things like publishing allowances that members of parliament have. There's the advantage that you have of doing advertising for a big group of people who are running in seats all around the country, and advertising doesn't stop at electorate borders. So these things are really complex, and there are a variety of ways that we could solve the inequity of the current situation without having to give up on our aspirations to cap donations and spending. It could look like different caps, for example, if you're from a minor party or running as an independent versus if you're from a large party. It could look like different spending caps if you're in a regional versus a metro electorate. And we know that the costs of running ads, for example, really vary depending what media market you're in. So I think it's really critical that when we get to the point of actually writing this legislation, the consultation that the government does is incredibly thorough and done in good faith, so that the outcome that we get creates a more fair and open democracy and not a more closed one. But I'm really confident that none of this is too difficult to solve. And I really think that we can't give up on the project, because dealing with state capture is such an important outcome for the health of our democracy overall. But totally agree that accidentally kind of pulling up the drawbridge and making it so that no one who's not in Parliament today or part of an established party can ever put their hand up and run, that wouldn't be a particularly pro-democratic outcome either.
I'm going to ask a question which I feel I should know the answer to, but can you explain state capture and what that term means?
Yes, I feel like I should have the definition completely memorized by now, but essentially state capture is what happens when powerful special interests are able to exert so much influence over our political system and the mechanics of policy making that they've essentially captured the system, and they can get outcomes which prioritize their profits over the well-being of everyone else. So I always go to climate change as the best poster child example of state capture. The fossil fuels industry has prevented us from having a legit federal climate policy for 2 decades, in spite of escalating impacts of the climate crisis and really solid public support. Most Australians want our federal government to deliver far more ambitiously than they've been able to. And that's because the fossil fuels industry has done such an excellent job of capturing our federal government. And the way that they've done it has in large part lent on lobbying, massive donations, huge election spends, all of the things we're trying to fix.
Hypothetically speaking, if you were to face a pandemic, for instance, and your response was, let's have a gas-fired recovery, hypothetically speaking, that might be a good example of state capture.
I think you dealt with that very comprehensively in Big Deal, Craig.
I think we didn't. To be honest, we could have done a whole documentary on that, but
we've got a couple of sort of mechanics questions, as in, making the submission. Don wants to know about handwritten submissions because he likes the idea of their authenticity. So if somebody was to handwrite their submission and not go through your portal, what would be your advice about that? And also someone else wants to know, is there an option on your portal for a copy of the submission to go to your MP?
Great question. And personally, I love the idea of handwriting a submission. I think the best way to do that would be to write the submission and then either scan it or take a photo of it and then email it to, I'll just drop the email in here, directly to the committee. And you'll be able to find more information on our FAQ page as well about how you can include other attachments like photographs or videos or links and stuff like that. The second question.
Someone to submit a rap, okay?
interpretive dance.
Yeah.
That would be
Send it to
great.
me too after.
What was the second question, Marie?
About having a function on the portal where a copy would go, or you would get your MP's email address so that a copy could go to your MP.
Great question. So currently on our portal, there is no option to pop that in as well. And I would suggest that if you wanted to do that, a copy of your submission is going to be sent to your inbox. And I think the best way to get that to your MP is to actually copy and paste that and send it directly to your MP. Find their email just through a quick Google search.
Can I jump in, Marie? I just happened to be up at Parliament House today meeting with someone, and we were discussing all of these submissions to the JSCAM committee. And that member of Parliament had chaired another committee process and said that whenever people who had written independent submissions as private citizens had reached out to them as the chair of the committee, they'd always taken a meeting with them. So in addition to sending your submission to your own MP and asking them for a follow-up conversation, could be a good idea to send it directly to the chair of the committee, Kate Thwaites, if you feel so minded. She might take a meeting with you and you can speak directly to the committee chair and share what you think.
Great. Boy, people are going to be busy after tonight's call. I can see that. We have a question here from Thor, who says, even when a submission is accepted, the committee are under no obligation to give any sort of meaningful response. It's left to subsequent committees. So, Saffron, that's probably a question for you.
Yeah, they're under no obligation. That's true. And I'm sure, they get a volume of submissions where they can't necessarily respond to everything that they receive. I think the point of engaging in this process is not necessarily the response that you'll get from them independently, but the effect that we'll have collectively by showing that there is really broad public support for action on this stuff, and this government needs to get on and prioritise it.
So another question that has come up is, what are the other ways that we can show our support for donation transparency, for real-time donation registration and caps on donations? You've talked about meeting with your MP, but are there other things that we can do?
I mean, again, one thing I think is really good is that the people that are here are kind of well and truly ahead of the curve. Like, that this is happening and it's going on. Share it through your other networks with other people who might be interested, because most people don't know this is happening. And as we've seen in lots of polling, most people care about this. And the fascinating thing about this issue is that most people care about it across the whole political spectrum. It's quite a unifying thing, whether you're Liberal, Labor, Independent, or otherwise. You want to see less influence from money. You want to see a fairer political system underlying it, no matter what your actual politics. So yeah, tell others about it. Tell them to get involved as well.
Terrific. Now, I've seen a question from Joy about saying that she's a bit time poor and wants a submission template for her to edit. Is this appropriate or a bit risky based on what we said before, where we're conscious that we want those submissions through the portal to be seen as individual? What's your reflections on that, Cheryl or Saffron?
Yeah, great question. I think I popped it into the chat there. You can find some examples of different submissions that have already been made. And you can see that a lot of them are actually only just a few sentences long. And they really don't take, it could take you 5 minutes, it could take you 10 minutes. Just have a think about the terms of references, how they affect you, how they affect the political system, and just do a little bit of writing about, what recommendations you think that need to change. And yeah, you can take a bit of inspiration from submissions that have already been made, but it's just really important to note that you can't copy and paste. There's no template. It won't be accepted if it's just a duplicate of another submission.
It's more important that you send it through with spelling mistakes and in your own language than that you copy and paste another one, I think. And the
Absolutely.
examples that Cheryl gave are great. That was such
Yes.
beautifully simple examples there,
Yeah. Yeah, terrific. And if this is the Joy that I think it is, Joy, I know that you have got quite a knack for getting letters published. So I don't think that you're going to have any trouble writing a very short submission. So, so there we go. Sheila, I'm just going to ask you if there are any other questions that I've missed that I should be asking.
Oh, that's a loaded question. Yes, there are, but I think we are running low on time. I think a really important one is that continues to be asked is what can we expect? What changes can this lead to?
Look, can I answer that? Let me give you my answer. Firstly, it will not lead to all the changes that we do want, but it will lead to important steps. And I think there is a bit of a push on there. And guys, years ago, I engaged with one of these parliamentary committees. Much to my surprise, we got great public servants engaged and came back to us now, and we got rules changed about satire in Parliament, that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of the time we presume that everyone is a bad actor and that no change will come, and that's the wrong approach to do that. So look, if you go into it with the right intentions, they will take it that way, and hopefully we'll get change.
Great answer. So there's your answer, Paula, and many of us that are, full of hope or skepticism, what has happened and what can happen, and how to go into this with what mentality. So thank you for that. That was just a good one to wrap up.
So Saffron, do you have any final comments that you want to make about the process or the inquiry or the issue? Final words from you.
Thank you. I think hopefully you're all persuaded that popping in a submission would be a useful way to spend 15 minutes this evening or tomorrow. Please go ahead and do that. And then I think just to follow up what Craig said, we may not get everything that we want, but we actually think that we are at a moment of real opportunity. We work together through the election and elected a parliament that know they have a mandate to take action on integrity issues. And they can see the political opportunity of leading rather than choosing to do nothing. We are going to be working on this for the next 3 years to get every single little tiny drop of progress that we can get out of this parliament. And we really need everyone along with us because we are pushing a really ambitious reform agenda, but we're asking for what democracy needs rather than what is politically convenient. So just encourage you all to jump over to the website, sign yourself up, and Cheryl has got like a long string of great ideas for different things that we can do together. So keep in touch.
Fabulous. Thank you so much to all of our great speakers tonight and all of your great questions. But I'm going to hand over to Sheila to wrap up so that she can let you know the next steps that we'll be supporting you with this process.
Amazing. Amazing evening and so much love in the chat. So everyone who showed up and giving your feedback and your questions, we can't thank you enough. So again, thanks so much, Craig, Saffron, and Cheryl, for such an informative, inspiring session. I know I feel far more confident about why and how to craft my submission. So maybe before you go, give a thumbs up in the chat if you feel the same and if you plan on making one. So we'd love to know the impact it's made. If we've all done our jobs well, then tonight will result in lots of additional submissions leading up to Friday, 7th of October, the deadline that is for the submission. So be mindful that we are in the final stretch. What will happen next is we'll send out a recording of tonight by Wednesday. That is our timeline expectations. And really, like Craig said, please share this with those that might be interested but aren't even aware this is happening. I know when I was running out of my office this afternoon saying, I've got to go do this, and there's a federal election inquiry, and my colleague said, in what country? And that was hard for me to hear, but it's true. There's not a lot of people aware that this is going on. So if you do have any questions, you can email us at info@voicesofmackellar.org.au or via our Democracies contact page. So again, thanks for joining us tonight. And if you want to keep in touch with the work of Voices of MacKellar, save the link to our website in the chat. Subscribe to our newsletters, and you can also follow us on our social media channels. Have a lovely evening and happy submission writing from the voices of MacKellar and our panelists.